We're going to start off this course with some background information about APIs. So what exactly is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface. This means that the API allows two systems to communicate with each other. Let's take a real-world example. Let's take the technology out of it for this example and just say, imagine you go to a fast food restaurant and they have a drive-thru. You go to that drive-thru and you make an order. This order is called a request in terms of APIs. And once you've given the order, the person at the drive-thru window will process that, meaning that they'll enter it in, they'll get your drink, they'll get your burger and get your fries, they'll bag it up, and they will then pass it back to you. This is called a response. So how APIs communicate is through a request and response kind of back and forth flow. We will see more examples of that in the upcoming videos. So there are two typical types of web service APIs. So there is SOAP or there is REST. And some popular APIs that are out there that you can look up and use, and these are free to use, are Google Maps, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So in this course, we're going to be dealing with REST APIs. What REST stands for is Representational State Transfer. So as I mentioned, there's REST and SOAP. So SOAP is a protocol, output is in XML, and SOAP is basically what was there before REST. So SOAP services are still out there, but they are quickly being replaced by REST services and becoming less common. REST is an architecture style. The output is in HTML, XML, or JSON. I'm going to give you a quick example of how APIs work with applications. So here's a short little diagram that I have here. This is very, very simple, so don't get upset because it's not in depth. You'll learn more as we go along, but I just want to give you a very high level overview. So we have the client, which is going to be your computer basically that you're accessing. So your laptop, your phone, your tablet, whatever. So there are a couple ways that you can interact with the API. So you can go directly to the API, or you can go to a website, and that'll be calling the API also. So say you go to google.com, right? So in the top of the diagram here, the client is going to the web server. So you typed in google.com, and then you type in something into the search and hit enter, and then it's going to send an API request to their API servers, and then they're going to go into their database and find information, or their API server could do some calculation or perform some function, and then that's going to come back to you that's going to go back to the web server first, and then it's going to come back to you with the brand new page with your results. So say you went to google.com, typed in apple pie, and then the API server is going to do its thing, get the information, tell the web server what to display. The web server is going to send that back to your computer, and then you're going to see a bunch of links, images, videos about apple pie. All right, so that's the typical way that most people are interacting with APIs. Another way is that you can just interact with the API pretty much directly. You can open a web browser if it's a simple API, and you can just type in the endpoint for the API. And we'll discuss endpoints coming up in the next video, but just bear with me. You can just type in the endpoint in the web browser, and then the web browser will give you back data. So it's not going to give you any pretty pictures or any formatted website or anything. It will just give you, in the case of REST APIs, it's most likely going to give you JSON data, and then we'll see what that looks like later on. But just kind of keep this image in the back of your mind so that you kind of understand what's going on behind the scenes on how, like, where the API is going in respect to your computer. Alright, so we're going to quickly go over API endpoints. So an endpoint for an API is just the URL that is making the request. So as you see here, there is a URL. So this is for the REST countries API. So this is an endpoint. Alright, so let's take this endpoint apart a little bit so you can get some terminology. So here is the root path. So you're always going to have this HTTP or HTTPS part at the front, and then it's going to have the name of the server, where it's hosted at. So this would change based on whoever's API is. If it was like the Google API, it might be google.com. If it's Facebook, it might be facebook.com, and then /rest. So this is the path to their API service. So /rest /v2. So you'll notice that this part is going to stay the same regardless of what the URL is. So let me show you this real fast. So the resource path is the resource that you are accessing. So basically you can take resources as like different parts of functionality that you can access, and you access them by the path. So the first one here, so the path of all, so you can see base path plus the all for the resource path. For their API, it's going to give you all the countries, and then you can do one for name. So if you specify a name, it will give you some information about the country. You can get the currency, you can get the language, you can get the calling code. So these are all basically different functionality that can be accessed via this one API. Each API call or request is going to invoke one of 5 request methods. The request methods are going to, you need to think of them in terms of like a database, right? Because you're going to be reading data, you're going to be creating data, you're going to be updating data and deleting data. This is CRUD, right? In databases, if you're familiar with create, read, update, delete, that's very common terminology for databases. So kind of if you understand the database part of it, then this is going to be very simple for you to know, because how the API is going to work is going to be pretty much the same. Alright, so the first one is get. This is the read. So the get request asks the server for information, and the server returns it. So in the previous example from the other video, when we talked about endpoints, if you did a currency get request, then that request would return the type of currency for that country. Alright, so in database terms, this would be the select statement, right? So you would select something from a certain table, and then you would get some information back. So for the API, it's exactly the same. All right. For a post is the create. So post request creates a new record in the database. So this is going to be where you are going to a website for the first time, and then you have to register. So they're going to create your account. So this would be a post request. All right. The next one is going to be a put or a patch. These are somewhat interchangeable. There's often debate about which one is better and which one should be used for certain scenarios. But just kind of remember that these are updating. So these requests will update an existing record in the database. So yep, just like in databases, this is an update. So it's taking an existing record. So for example, if you wanted to change your password for that account that you just created, so you would do a put or a patch, and then you would say, give it some information to verify that you are who you say you are, and tell it what your new password should be, right? The last one is called delete. The delete is going to do just as it says. It's going to delete a record from the database. So this is a very dangerous one, because typically in databases you don't want to just be going and deleting data from it. So this one is probably something you won't see very often. Usually when you're working with databases, You don't want to delete the data. You want to just make it no longer active, or put some sort of indicator that says don't use this data anymore, but you don't want to lose data, which is what delete is. So it's out there, but it's not very common. So just kind of remember that it's there if ever needed. All right, we're going to talk about HTTP status codes. So status codes are returned by the server to give a status of how the requested transaction was handled. So when you sent one of those get, post, put, delete requests over that we just learned about, the response from the API server is going to be have multiple parts to it, but the first thing that it's going to send is a status code. So a status code is just a 3-digit number that gives you quick information about what happened with the request. So this is really important to mobile and web applications, because they will use the status code to determine what happened in the transaction, to know whether it passed, it succeeded or failed very quickly without having to look through the rest of the code, because they can just use that number. So let me give you a list of common status codes. So there are a lot more than this. So they're going to come in variations. There's going to be the 200 levels, the 400 levels, and the 500 levels. So 200s are going to be like the happy path. These are good. Things are good to go. Everything looks good. That's what the 200 levels are for. 400s are called client-side errors. So this is because you sent something, or the application sent something to the API server that the API server knows is bad. So for example, the API server is expecting a number, but you sent a letter instead. So you're going to get a 400 bad request, most likely from the API server, because it knows to look for that, and then you sent it's something that it didn't want, so it's going to tell you no, basically. And then a 500 level is going to be something that is called a server-side error. So this is when you send something that the API server doesn't know how to handle. So let's say, using that example that I just gave, you sent a number, but the API server only knows how to deal with letters, and you didn't put any safeguards in to say that I only want a letter and not a number. Alright, so in that case, there's going to be an exception error, and the server doesn't know how to respond. So that's going to be a client-side error. So that's just if you ever wanted to see a full list of HTTP status codes, you can Google it. There's a lot. There's probably like 40, 50, 60 of them. And I haven't seen all of them used in the real world, but the list here is the ones that you are going to find most common out when you are working with stuff and testing stuff. We're going to briefly go over headers. So headers are additional information passed by the client or server. There are two types of headers. There's a request header and there's a response header. So the request header is going to come from the client side, obviously, because this is the requesting side. It's going to include information such as the type of method, possibly the path, and some other information that might be required by the API. So basically the purpose of the request header is to make sure that everything that the requesting or that the API server is expecting is in that request header. There are things like authorization headers that many APIs require. Think of it like a secret passcode that allows the API server to know that you are allowed to make this request. Sometimes those type of things are required in a request header in order for the API server to accept the response. If you don't have an authorization header and they're requiring one, then you'll get a 401 unauthorized response back from the API. All right, and then if you look at the bottom here, The response headers is just going to give you information about the request response. This is not something that you're going to be able to really modify because in this course we're just talking about understanding APIs from a testing level. So the response header would be more geared towards a developer who's building the APIs, and they would need to possibly tweak something on there to allow it to work properly with you. But you can see in there that there is a status code of 200 here. So for whatever request that I sent for this, the response in the header includes that status code. Okay, so we're going to talk about request and response bodies. So these are data passed to or from the API server. So in the last lesson we talked about headers. This is additional data that needs to be passed. So these are the things that are going to be really important to the client side or to you because this is the information. So I have a little snippet of JSON in here. We're going to learn more about JSON in a different lesson, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but you can see that it has some basic information. It has first name of Joe and last name of somebody. So in a request, you would use this usually in like a post or a put method. So for example, it's like I want to add my first name to my account. So you'll do a put method, and then you'll tell it what your first name and last name is. Obviously, there's some information missing because how do you know what my account is based on just this information? So those are probably going to come in parameters for your URL, but we'll cover that in a later lesson. So this JSON data can be used by the request, but then also this is going to be what you're looking at all the time for the response. So when you do a get, let's say get me my personal information, might be the call. The response is going to be your first name is Joe and then your last name is somebody. So this is going to be that data. So whenever you're doing a get, as long as it's a valid request and you get a 200, you're going to get some information back. All right. So this is just kind of like a short 2-minute answer of what a request and response body is. We will learn much more about it in the upcoming videos because we'll be looking at it pretty much non-stop once we get to the portion of the course where we're testing the API. So hello and welcome to my new course. It is called the QA Guide to REST API Testing for Beginners. In this course you're going to learn a lot about APIs, how they work, how to test them, and all sorts of things. So let's take a quick look at the content here. So we have a quick introductory section and followed by API basics. Well, you will learn how APIs work and how they are composed. Moving on down, we're going to learn a little bit about working with JSON data using the Sublime Text tool. So you'll learn how to validate and format data quickly and easily so that it becomes readable. The next section is going to go over JavaScript and JSON data. So you're going to learn some JavaScript, which is required for you to understand how to create and manipulate JSON data. And the bulk of the course is going to be in the next few sections here. So you're going to learn how to use the Postman tool to create requests. So you're going to be able to create all the different kinds of requests, and we're going to use a few open APIs to test with. And following that, we're going to have a section on Postman testing. So we will create test cases for the API request that you created in the previous section, and I will show you how to create tests that will run automatically every time you make a request. All right, and we'll do a quick section on using the developer tools to view requests that come from the browser, followed by one of my favorite tools, Fiddler. So Fiddler is a proxy tool that allows you to capture traffic that's going through your computer. So we're going to use this to be able to see and manipulate traffic that's going through your computer, and it's a very handy tool for testing. All right, and then we'll just wrap it up from there and you'll be good to go. All right, so I hope you take this course and enjoy it, and it is a very valuable piece of your arsenal if you are going to be a QA tester, especially if you want to be more of a full stack kind of tester, testing from the bottom up. This is one of the core pieces that you will need.